Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT Podcast with your hosts, Michael Maleka
and Molly Hudash.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Jack Westin MCAT Podcast with your hosts, Mike and Molly. Last episode, we got into a whole lot of fun material, especially with the cardiovascular and the respiratory systems, right? And how we move fluids inside and outside of the body. And that's going to form the groundwork for today's episode. Mike, how's it going? And what are we talking about?
So great, Molly. Always great to see you. It was really awesome talking about like the cardio respiratory, especially after building off of fluids and seeing like how the fluids related to the cardiovascular and respiratory system. Again, things are flowing. But today we're again focusing really on why those systems are really important for homeostasis and equilibrium, right? This idea of like keeping everything constant, because again, there are so many external things that happen to the body that our body has to deal with. So we need mechanisms in order to sort of keep everything the same. But we also want to talk about how the MCAT's going to test us on this. So we're going to be talking especially about some very high yield applications that whenever I think of like, and I'm sure you think this too, whenever there's like a homeostasis question, you can bet money on like which topic they're going to ask about when it's like a homeostasis question. It's like, it's going to be like one of like four things, right? So again, familiarizing yourself with how they ask these questions, I think is going to be really cool.
Yes, for sure. Right. So we're going to get into homeostasis, which we'll define for you in a second. If you're hearing that and you're like, what the heck is that?
What is that thing?
And this idea of equilibrium, right? How we maintain constant or consistent conditions within the human body, right? And again, I think it's important to have context here, right? Imagine you're too cold. I'm uncomfortable. I want to get warmer. Imagine your blood pressure is too high. This is going to damage our vessels. We need to get the blood pressure down, right? Like our body has conditions that it likes, and we need to learn how our body responds to changes in those conditions. And again, like you said, this is incredibly high yield material because ultimately it applies to pretty much every body system. Although, yes, you're right. There are specific applications which we'll get into today. But ultimately, I think it's important to address the fact that the AMC and the MCAT in general loves to test on balance because in many ways, balance is crucial, not just to your physiological function, but also your like cognitive function, your emotional function,
lifestyle,
just like you as a human, right? Like, and they love to test on, okay, systems currently balanced, but what if I throw this at you or at this situation? Now, what is it going to do? How's it going to react? They love those dynamic situations.
I like that term, dynamic situation, right? Like what changes, what happens next, right? Yep.
Especially because we talked about fluid dynamics in our first content episode.
Okay, now we're a lot of connections there. Maybe a little bit different.
Yeah, a little different, different.
Yeah.
But yeah, the whole idea is how do we maintain optimal conditions? And if suddenly we disrupt those optimal conditions and something happens to disrupt that system, how are we going to react? Right. So I think let's start with homeostasis. I think for many of us, it's a little more comfortable, right? Can you define this for us in case anyone was zoning out while we were talking about homeostasis?
Absolutely. Homeostasis is this idea that there is a state that our body's in that it wants to stay at. There is an ideal place. However, the body is never always at that place, right? It's not a static state. Right? It's a dynamic state like we were talking about before. So our body is always trying to reach that state, but then sometimes overshoots it. I kind of like to think about like the Latin name, like homeostasis, like stasis is freeze and homeo is person. So like they keep the person like in that place. And so the idea is that we're always trying to reach this place. So for example, if we our like blood, like our temperature, for example, right? If we're too cold, our body's going to react in ways it's going to make us warmer, but maybe we get a little bit too warm. So our body kind of then changes, so it makes us a little bit cooler. And it's never like staying in one place. It's always kind of mediating back and forth from that ideal scenario. And this is the idea, but it applies, like you were talking about before, to so many conditions. We like bringing up temperature, but relates to pH, carbon dioxide concentration, blood glucose, blood pressure, osmolarity. I mean, and those are kind of like the big ones for the MCAT, but there's so many other places, like endocrine system, for example, and the different types of
Mhm.
control for the endocrine system. We like staying in one place for most hormones, not all, most hormones.
Yeah.
But that kind of brings us to like how our body actually does that. Because I love kind of, there was this saying that my one physiology professor always liked to say about the wisdom of the body. Like the
Mm.
body is not in itself conscious. Like your enzymes, your hormones, they don't think. But there's all these mechanisms that they do for the ultimate goal of homeostasis. And when we kind of look at it, zoom out, it looks like a really wise system, but in reality, it's all just mechanisms. It's all just reactions in order to get to that place. And so there's a two kind of main mechanisms when we talk about getting back to that homeostatic balance. So, I mean, when I think of homeostasis, Molly, I think of negative feedback. Like
Yeah.
100%, I'm thinking about it. So, like, walk us through like what is this kind of array of like negative feedback?
Yeah. So negative feedback as an idea is very much if you disrupt, if you're at equilibrium, you disrupt it, you want to bring it back to where you were before.
Mhm,
Right. So if you have some sort of stimulus, let's say you are inside, right? You're in your apartment, you're in your house, you're in the grocery store, whatever. You're nice, it's a nice room temperature. Cool. Let's say it's a winter day. You go outside and you're cold, right? You have a stimulus, which is I am now cold,
mhm,
right? I am uncomfortably cold. It's like, okay, negative feedback is going to say my body's going to respond in a way that's going to bring my temperature back up to what I wanted it to be,
mhm.
right? My response to a stimulus is going to essentially eliminate that stimulus, right? So
Absolutely.
I'm too cold,
Mhm,
right? And physiologically, okay, I'm too cold. I need to create heat and make sure I'm maintaining that heat, right?
mhm,
My body is going to constrict the blood vessels in my skin so
mhm,
that I don't have a lot of my body heat leaving off the surface of my skin, right?
mhm,
That's keeping the heat that I have in my body, and it's
mhm,
going to stimulate shivering,
mhm.
right? Because muscular contraction creates heat, right?
A
It's
lot
not
of
a
heat.
perfect process. It's releasing heat. So I'm protecting the heat that I have and I'm heating it up. Also, my brain is involved here too, right?
Mhm,
Um, my brain is going to say, "Hey, you're cold. Go put on some extra layers. Get out of the winter chill, right?
yeah,
Warm yourself up." Now I'm back to my nice room temperature. I got my jacket on. I've been shivering a little bit. Now I'm comfortable again. I'm not cold anymore. So the
mhm,
pathway that led to me warming myself up is now shut off,
mhm,
right? To summarize negative feedback, if you have a stimulus that's disrupting your equilibrium in some way, your body's going to respond in order to come back to that equilibrium.
mhm.
And in the process, it's going to turn off that pathway,
Right,
right? You're
right,
going to stop warming yourself up once you're already warm, right?
right. Very
You
much
don't want to
getting back to that.
overheat.
Right? Again, very much getting back to that homeostasis. You overshot it a little bit, so you're like, okay, wait, hold up, no more heat. I think again, temperature is one great place, but I think another again very MCAT testable place, and I know you love talking about this one too, is insulin. Insulin is also another great example from like more of like a chemical biological approach where insulin, this really important hormone, is really important for glucose uptake by the cells, and its main role is to decrease glucose. So the stimulus that we were talking about before, right? The stimulus here is we've got too much glucose in the blood. Too much glucose, very, very dangerous if we have too much glucose. So uncontrolled diabetes, so many symptoms. So our body needs to respond to this high glucose, so it releases insulin from the pancreas. That
Mhm.
release of insulin is going to cause the glucose to be uptaken by your cells, decreasing the glucose. The decreased glucose has a negative feedback mechanism on the release of insulin. Because we decrease the glucose, we don't need insulin anymore. So that decreased glucose is going to say to the pancreas, hey, we don't need the insulin before, so the insulin is stopped being produced. Okay. Again, that idea where the thing that our outcome is going to cause the mechanism to stop, right? That's that negative feedback, like you were saying before in temperature. And then insulin is just another great way that we see that. But again, these are just two examples in the plethora of examples
Yeah.
we see, because this is all about maintaining that homeostasis. Most hormones have this mechanism.
Yes.
Most bodily systems have this mechanism because, again, we want to keep things at homeostasis, but there's another mechanism that isn't as homeostatic. Well, talking about that
Yeah.
mechanism.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like it's important whenever you talk about homeostasis to recognize that oftentimes life is a balancing act. And if you
Mhm,
go too far to either extreme, you get too hot or you get too cold, right? Blood pressure gets too high or it gets too low. Blood glucose gets too high, it gets too low. It's dangerous on either side,
mhm,
right? Regardless of how we mess with our homeostatic parameter, we need to bring it back to the middle ground because that's
mhm,
where it's safe. You go
mhm,
too far to either extreme and you're in a, you know, problematic
mhm,
state, right? So
mhm,
negative feedback brings you back to that happy middle ground where you're
mhm,
safe. When we talk about the other feedback mechanism that
mhm,
you're hitting at here,
mhm.
we do something totally different.
So we are
And
trying to hit the extreme.
yes. So the other option, rather than negative feedback, where the response to a stimulus shuts off, it shuts itself off,
Mechanism,
basically.
sure.
Um, with positive feedback, what we say is we have a stimulus that, creates a response. That response amplifies itself like a snowball, right? It's
Mhm,
just getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger
mhm.
rather than, oh, we created a change, let's make the change and then turn it
Get
off,
back.
right?
Mhm,
Again, we were cold, and so we warm ourselves up back to our happy body temperature, and then we're done. That's like I was cold, and so I threw myself into the fire, right? Like you've
right.
gone way overboard. Like you put
Mhm,
every piece of clothing on and then you had heat stroke, like
mm,
way too much, right?
right.
That's the idea of positive feedback is you just keep amplifying that um, response.
Mhm,
The response activates itself. And there
mhm.
really are only a couple instances
Only a
of
few,
this.
right,
And before we list them, I do want to just make sure we're all comfortable with the fact that we do not have positive feedback forever, right? It could not be forever. This
mhm,
snowball continues to get bigger, right?
right.
It typically is activated for a little while and then once
Comes back down.
whatever response is achieved, we're done with it, right? So it's a
Right,
temporary system,
right,
but
because
there
of the
are,
like, lack of homeostatic idea, right? Because our body likes homeostasis, right? It likes staying the same. We can't have this, like, kind of, like, spiraling mechanism forever, right? That would just
yeah.
conflict with our goal of the body. So I know, sorry for cutting over. I knew you were about to mention the positive feedback,
I was going
examples,
to let you
obviously.
do that actually. So you take it away,
Oh my goodness, I'd be honored.
please, after you.
Thank you. Whenever I think about positive feedback, this idea where the kind of the outcome just kind of really amplifies the mechanism, I think about childbirth, like
Yeah.
first and foremost. And so the hormone that we see there is oxytocin, where during childbirth, the child is being birthed, and during that birthing process, there's a stretching of the uterine lining. That stretching leads to the release of oxytocin from the hypothalamus, or creation by the hypothalamus, then release at the posterior pituitary, which increases the amount of oxytocin. Oxytocin works to stimulate more contraction of the uterus, which causes more stretching. More stretching leads to more oxytocin. More oxytocin leads to more contractions. More contractions, more stretching. And it's this loop and loop and loop. And for if there's anyone listening right now who's ever seen childbirth or experienced childbirth, like they know like the contractions just keep being stronger and stronger and come in waves of these stronger one. And to actually a lot of the times, if contractions like haven't begun or they need to stimulate contractions, do you know what they actually like inject?
Interesting. I wonder if they inject oxytocin.
Absolutely, they do that. They just inject oxytocin to get that spiral going of contraction, stretching, contraction, stretching until the baby is birthed. Because once it is, that's what we were talking about before. This is not going to last forever. We definitely don't want that to last forever. Right? Once the baby's birthed, there's no longer any stretching, no longer any stimulus, so then you just get cut off the contractions end. But this
Yeah.
is kind of like one of those main kind of examples that when I think of it, of like, oh, this really intense, just getting more and more extreme, extreme, extreme. But it's not the only one. I know there's others as well, Molly. You want to talk about the others?
Yeah. And I think it's a fun transition after childbirth to think of actually oxytocin, but also prolactin, which are
Hmm.
additional positive feedbacks. It's interesting how essentially three of the four, oxytocin in childbirth and then oxytocin in lactation and prolactin in lactation, they're all related to,
Child.
childbirth and motherhood
Hmm.
essentially. But we could talk about how these hormones are involved in lactation responses. So if you have suckling happening, right, your baby's trying to feed, that stimulates the milk production and the milk letdown reflexes in your body. So if you have an infant that is nursing, your body will produce milk and then allow for milk ejection, right? So the baby can get adequate nutrition. But again, you don't want this to happen forever because breast milk is incredibly costly for the body to produce.
Because of the
Very
calcium.
energy dense,
Mhm.
right? You don't want to be producing that forever because as a, mother, it steals a lot of your energy, right? And it's
Mhm.
worth it because it's your
Of
child.
course, your baby, right? Of
But
course.
you don't want to do that forever, right? So that is a positive feedback loop for as long as your infant is nursing.
Mhm.
But once you remove that stimulus of the nursing, right? Um, you stop that, right? So you
Right.
no longer are making milk.
Mhm.
So that's another one as well. It's kind of a
Mhm.
twofer, right, with
Mhm.
oxytocin and prolactin, but
Right.
both of those relate to the lactation reflex. And
Mhm.
really, there's one other one that we haven't yet talked about.
Yeah. This one's kind of like I like putting an asterisk on this one because like the last one is estrogen. Now, when I say estrogen, it's very interesting because males and females have estrogen. And currently, do we have spiraling, skyrocketing amounts of estrogen at the moment?
Yep.
No, we do not, right? And so I like putting an asterisk because it only becomes under positive feedback in a very specific situation, in a very, very specific situation, right? And
Yes.
that is ovulation, right? That is to trigger ovulation. Again, this very kind of like one day thing. So what happens is when during the menstrual cycle, during the follicular phase of the menstrual cycle, estrogen is slowly going to be produced by that growing follicle, right? Slowly going to be produced and slowly going to rise. And then during that time, it's negative feedback. So normally FSH and LH are being inhibited. These things that normally stimulate estrogen are inhibited, but the
These
estrogen
are hormones, by the way,
Yes,
just in
I should
case.
be very clear. These are hormones that we're discussing. We have a whole like endocrine like lecture like in a few episodes. But to context, yes, these are hormones that trigger these pathways. But estrogen is slowly going to rise and inhibit like under negative feedback the FSH and LH, the hormones that normally stimulate estrogen, until the estrogen reaches a critical concentration. Right? Once the estrogen reaches that critical concentration, it switches. It switches and now it goes under positive feedback. And this is where you have a surge of the things that normally produce estrogen, like FSH and LH. This surge is what we call the LH surge, and is what actually triggers ovulation, the leaving of that oocyte from the follicle, and actually transitions to the lacteal phase. And so this is one scenario, and why again asterisk, because estrogen only is normally negative feedback and only switches during this one scenario. Because I know sometimes a student will get a question like, what feedback mechanism is estrogen under? The answer is negative feedback, unless the question is talking about ovulation. Then in this one scenario, it's positive feedback because that's what actually triggers that surge.
Yeah. I feel like that would be a pretty mean question because
I've
estrogen's
seen it,
really
yeah.
the only one that rides that line.
Mhm,
But again, just to summarize for those of us who are less comfortable with the menstrual cycle, right?
mhm,
We have one specific instance of
mhm,
positive feedback. 99% of the time, we have negative feedback. But like you said, estrogen's relationship to LH and FSH, which ultimately lead to estrogen production, is concentration dependent. Low
mhm,
concentrations and medium concentrations, it's going to shut those things off.
mhm.
After it reaches this peak, suddenly it amplifies,
Right.
right? So that is going to be obviously a more complicated instance of positive feedback. And
Mhm.
we know that. We will
Yes.
talk about that when we get into hormones, right? And
Mhm.
we're noticing a lot of trends here.
Relations, right?
Homeostasis has a
Mhm.
lot to do with hormonal cascades, right? The other one that sometimes people will mention is blood clotting, right?
Sure.
If you get a cut and suddenly you have clotting factors activated, you want to make sure that you build that clot and build it fast until
Mhm.
you no longer are leaking, right?
Mhm. Sure.
Um,
Leaking is such a great way to put it. Like not bleeding, you're just leaking blood out of you.
Well, I mean, as we talked about last episode, right? How fast you bleed depends on what the
Sure.
pressure inside of that blood vessel was, if this is an artery or a capillary or a vein.
Sure.
Um, are we spurting? Are we oozing? It
Is it
doesn't,
just
it
news?
depends. It
Hmm.
depends, right, on what you
Hmm.
cut because of the pressure difference. But blood clotting is often brought up here as well as part of positive feedback.
Hmm.
But, right, I want you guys to recognize these are, it seems like, we spent a fair amount of time talking about positive feedback. That is not to suggest that this is more common. In fact, the reason why we've spent a decent chunk of time talking about positive feedback is because this is really the only times that we
Right.
see positive feedback in the body,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Our body is governed by negative feedback, right? That
Hmm.
is the normal situation. That is what homeostasis is, right? We have a stimulus that disrupts our equilibrium, and our job is to respond in a way that restores the equilibrium. That is the idea, right?
Hmm.
Again, we could talk about temperature, we could talk about pH, salinity, all of these things governed by negative
Negative
feedback.
feedback. Mhm.
So, as far as what you'll see on the MCAT, usually you'll describe a system that's in equilibrium,
Mhm.
right? And this could be, again, blood pressure, it could be, pH. And
Mhm.
then they'll say, hey, we're going to
Mhm.
mess with this, right?
Something happens.
You had great blood pressure, but now you're bleeding out. Blood pressure's dropping.
Right.
Or you had a nice balance of your respiratory gases, but now you are breathing really fast, or you're not breathing at all, or suddenly there's a difference in atmospheric pressure, so you get more or less oxygen. Now what?
Mhm.
Right?
I love
You're
it. I love
normal.
now what?
Now what?
Right. And I love that now what question because it's all about application now. Because
Yes.
now it doesn't matter if you know the definition of negative feedback. It doesn't matter.
Mhm.
Like and now it's all about sure, do you know it? But can you use it in this scenario? And this is where medicine, that's really the job of a physician. Because a lot of the times pathologies are issues where people are not in that balance. And
Yes.
your goal is to try to get them back into that balance. And again, that goes sort of so many metrics in terms of pain, in terms of like health, in terms of like again, so many things like pH and blood glucose. I mean, diabetes is a great example of people out of that balance. You're trying to get them back to that balance. So the
Mhm.
goal here is really that medical approach, that medical mindset of something's happened. What is your goal now? What is the body going to do? And again, now that you know what the body's going to do, you can think as a physician, what would you do? So again, all about that application, which I love. I mean, we love.
Yes. Yes. So, to give you guys one specific concrete example of negative feedback that's beyond just like, you're cold, so warm yourself up. One of the most common that you'll see, especially one that relates to our topic from last week, because
Mhm.
again, we want each episode to build on the previous, right, to get you a better understanding of these things. I think is blood pressure.
Mhm.
Again, you don't want blood pressure too low because, as
Mhm.
we talked about last week, blood is carrying oxygen and nutrients and waste products all around your body, right? Delivering the good stuff to
Mhm.
your cells, picking up the bad stuff and delivering it either to
Mhm.
the lungs to be breathed out, delivering it to the kidneys to be excreted, etc. Right? We don't want blood pressure too low, or else we
Mhm.
do not get adequate circulation. And as we talked about, blood pressure's too low chronically because our heart's not beating very much, we might get some swelling
Well,
going on in our feet and
Exhibit A.
ankles. Yes. If you don't know what we're talking about, go watch our last
The
episode.
Garage episode, Mike had an oopsie once. But yes, absolutely.
Yes. And of course, we also don't want blood pressure too high
Mhm.
because ultimately that can damage your blood vessel walls and hopefully not, but possibly create a situation where your blood vessel wall tears,
Mhm.
which is also very dangerous.
Better,
That
right?
would be a, that's not the direct cause of a story I shared last episode, but
Well, it
it's something that could also cause a
sure.
gross medical story.
Right, right. No, and that's why, like, again, bringing it back to that balance. And a lot of the times, especially in medicine, like, I mean, a lot of us have heard of like family members or friends who are on things like ACE inhibitors, for example, because their body, or as maybe as a result of something chronic, maybe something health wise, or maybe diet wise, is not able to get back to that balance normally. So a
Yeah,
lot of the times we need to intervene medically in order to help, I mean, and lifestyle wise, to get them back to balance, right? Because
love
a
that.
lot of the times for I mean, I actually don't want to get too ahead of myself, like talking about ACE inhibitors before we even talk about the RAS system. But a lot of times we want to like medically help when people have like too high blood pressure to get them back to basics, to get them back to that medium point.
I
Yeah.
actually like that you brought it up, especially because you brought in, when you induce labor, you can give someone oxytocin. It's kind of a similar idea, except
Right.
in this case, we're trying to turn it down.
Right.
So let's walk through blood pressure, kind of start to finish, and we'll see how we could build to that, right? So blood pressure, we know from last episode and from the episode previously, is the pressure that is flowing or that is, present within your bloodstream, pushing out on your vessel walls. We want to keep this in our nice middle ground. Again, we don't want too low, we don't want too high. Either way is dangerous. If though, let's say we get a little spooked, right? Something scares
Little
us,
spooked is wild.
blood pressure rises, right?
Sure.
Blood pressure can change pretty, not drastically, but it
Hmm.
can change, on a relatively short scale, with like sympathetic nervous system activation or parasympathetic nervous system activation, which is your fight and flight and your or fight or flight and rest and digest
Hmm.
respectively, which may be a more approachable set of terms, right? It has to do with, is blood pressure going up or down? But also on a more long-term scale, we could talk about, like you said, if we have chronically elevated blood pressure, rather than just changing the size of our arterial walls, um, arterial walls.
Yes.
By the way, not
Mhm.
arterial like arteries, arteriole as a different blood vessel.
Is that the one right after
The
arteries? Yes.
small one right after arteries.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
The nervous system on a short scale can change the size of those, vasodilate or vasoconstrict,
Mhm.
to change blood pressure on a short scale. But also, we should be thinking about water balance when it
Mhm.
comes to longer term blood pressure regulation. And
Mhm.
this is where we'll actually see the ACE part of ACE inhibitors start to come in here, right?
Right. Right.
With the RAS pathway.
I love the RAS system. I think the RAS system is cool because when I teach it, it's like, oh my gosh, this whole system, I have to memorize all these things. But then when you realize it is like a part of here that we've heard about outside. I think that's the coolest when you like hear something that, oh, I've heard of ACE inhibitors before. Oh,
Mhm,
ACE. Oh, that's what that is, right? When
mhm.
you make that connection to your like real world, like when you've seen, I think that's always the coolest. So RAS, for context, stands for the renin angiotensin aldosterone system. When I think about the RAS system, right, I think about what's the overarching goal of the RAS system, and that is to increase blood pressure, right? And so when I'm thinking about our feedback mechanisms, what do you think is the stimulus that leads to RAS activation?
So it would be lower blood pressure, right?
Right.
And again, we've got places in our vasculature that we measure blood pressure, especially
Hmm.
in our carotid artery and our aortic arch.
Hmm.
Um, if blood pressure is too low, RAS will be activated.
Right. And as well, another place which we will talk about very, very soon, another place that checks that blood pressure is the kidneys,
Yes.
which again, hint, hint, what might be coming very soon, is all these places, again, are those receptors. They have what are called baroreceptors that detect the stretching of the blood vessels. Because imagine if you have a lot of blood pressure or low blood pressure, you're going to be changing how much you're pushing on those blood vessel walls. So if you have too low of blood pressure, there's not as much pushing on the walls, which will be detected by these baroreceptors, showing that these baroreceptors are what we call mechanoreceptors. They respond to mechanical changes. They're not detecting like a chemical thing. There's no like compound that binds to a receptor. They're detecting what's the change, how is like the wall changing. And then that is what releases the first part, which is renin, right, from the juxtaglomerular cells. I swear I can never say that word. But juxtaglomerular cells from the kidneys, which leads to this whole pathway for angiotensin, then aldosterone, which I think we'll get like more into like the specifics of the pathway when we talk about maybe the nephron and the endocrine system, but with the goal of all these mechanisms to increase that blood pressure, right? Because again, the stimulus was low blood pressure. Then the goal of the RAS is to increase it. Then once we have high blood pressure, what do you think is going to happen to RAS?
It's going to stop being activated.
Right? Well, and which is a great example of negative feedback. Bring us back to that homeostasis. But then a problem sometimes is that we don't come back, right? We have our RAS system might be too activated, or maybe we have other factors that are
Dietary type stuff. Yeah.
dietary that are increasing our blood pressure. So sometimes our blood pressure is too high, so we need to actually stop the RAS system.
Mhm.
So there's this critical enzyme that's involved in the conversion of that second hormone, angiotensin, which is angiotensin converting enzyme, also known as
Mhm.
ACE.
Ace.
Right? So imagine, what do you think was going to happen if we inhibit this really critical enzyme in the RAS system?
Yeah. So just like we talked about, if someone's not experiencing labor, kickstarting that positive feedback, add oxytocin. In this case, we don't want this RAS system activated because its job is to increase your blood pressure. If our
Mhm,
blood pressure is already too high,
mhm,
we want to make sure this system is off
mhm,
because it's essentially going to make the problem worse. So if
mhm,
we inhibit angiotensin converting enzyme or ACE, we
mhm,
are shutting off the RAS pathway. We are
mhm.
preventing our already high blood pressure from getting higher,
Higher.
which is why you may hear ACE inhibitors being prescribed to treat hypertension or high blood pressure.
Right.
Um, so, super cool, right? We are turning off a system that would typically increase our blood
Mhm,
pressure. And
right.
I like that you brought up there's a lot of different reasons why an individual may have high blood pressure.
Mhm,
So we need to figure out what's going on with that individual, hopefully intervene if it is more of a lifestyle or dietary factor. Um, but again, as a physician, you're going to be poised
mhm,
to handle
mhm.
that very sort of interdisciplinary
Approach.
patient care. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's also really cool because so many people who are listening to this, like, this is their dream, to be working with patients, to be able to help them with not their lifestyle, but also how to medically, like, assist them when they need it. But notice how there's this one thing that we've heard of that we can see in day to day, the people that we care about, and we're learning about it now for the MCAT. A lot of the times we talk about this before that, oh, we feel like we have to learn this stuff. Like, oh my goodness, it's so annoying. I have to memorize the RAS system. But no, understanding these pathways are what's going to be critical for that patient care. That, because imagine if we didn't understand the RAS system, how could we, like, responsibly prescribe medications to our patients without
Yeah.
actually understanding these things that in order to aid them? So I think that's just one more again, one more reason on top of all the reasons why understanding these pathways, I think, are just so critical and important for our futures as physicians.
Yes,
Yeah.
for sure. And it's also going to help you get points on test day because
On
not only
test
is
day,
it,
which is the more short-term goal.
yes, short-term goal, not long-term goal, but it certainly is
Right.
important,
Right.
right? So RAS is a very long-term fix. It has to do with water balance, right?
Mhm,
So we will see this again, wink,
mhm,
wink, nudge, nudge, very soon
right.
in the future when we talk about kidneys. And we'll
Mhm,
also hit on it again when we talk about hormones. But again, the idea here is we have negative feedback. Blood pressure is too low, increase it back up to what we're comfortable with. Cool. If blood pressure is too high,
mhm,
right? We have other mechanisms for adjusting blood pressure, but one of the things we can do clinically is to prevent it from getting higher, which is what we
mhm.
want to do. Um, and again, this material can be tested on in a standalone capacity. Like, what do you know about the RAS pathway? But again, coming back to how this will show up on your exam, it's
Mhm,
all about the applications, right? You
mhm,
might see a passage that says, what if, imagine there's an individual who is overexpressing aldosterone, the
mhm,
final hormonal component of that cascade, which ultimately is going to prevent water loss, right?
mhm,
Increase water reabsorption in the kidney, which we'll talk about,
mhm.
right? Which increases your blood pressure, right? What would happen if you had a chronic overexpression of the gene responsible for aldosterone? It's like,
Mhm,
hmm, what could
mhm.
we imagine might be going on clinically with that patient? What do you think?
I'm already thinking, because again, this is where I get my big picture approach, where I'm thinking, well, if I'm overexpressing something that increases my blood pressure, I'm probably going to have really high blood pressure. But then we can even get to specifics as to how aldosterone increase that blood pressure, increasing that sodium absorption, causing an increase in that osmotic, like changing that osmotic balance and bringing that water in. But also, is kind of a cool fact, I'm probably going to have a low potassium, because part of that is kind of putting potassium into the kidneys. So I'm thinking, okay, like hypernatremia, which is high sodium in the blood. I'm thinking hypervolemia, like high volume of water in the blood, and I'm thinking hypokalemia, which is low potassium in the blood. So these are the things that I'm already like looking for in my answer options, even before I even see them.
Yes.
Mhm.
Not that you need to know any of that right now.
Not
That we
again.
will talk about.
This is you're. I got a question and I got excited. I'm thinking, all right, here's what I'm thinking about for aldosterone. Again, these are all things that we will like again talk about nephron and endocrine system, but how we should already start thinking about these questions, where it shouldn't be a surprise to see these sorts of answer options. We want to be anticipating using our application in our background. Yeah.
Yes.
Hmm.
And so we've talked a lot about essentially
Hmm.
finding equilibrium within the body,
Hmm.
right? And the body does this through homeostasis. Ultimately, like this is a very broad approach, right?
Hmm.
Again, we talked like you're made of so many different individual cells and tissues and organ
Really?
systems, right? Like it's your body is carrying out this
Mm.
beautiful balancing act between so many different cell types, tissue types, all of these things. Because ultimately, every one of those cells in your body is cooperating to keep you
Hmm.
alive. It's a
Hmm.
shared goal of keeping the organism alive, right?
Hmm.
So, homeostasis is a very, very grand scale
Hmm.
in many ways of this idea of equilibrium, right?
Hmm.
We could also zoom in this
Hmm.
scale a lot to like, smaller than even a cell, thinking of one individual chemical reaction. We could talk
Hmm.
about equilibrium with just, a handful of components in one little chemical reaction, right? And we
Hmm.
could talk about equilibrium there. So
Hmm.
these same ideas of you get too cold, well, warm yourself up back to your normal body temperature. You get too
Hmm.
hot, okay, cool yourself down. These same themes also apply to like a general chemistry concept. It's just now we will talk about chemical equilibrium instead of homeostasis.
Right, right. Very much going down to like the minutia, but it's really important because it's these sort of like it's these chemicals, like these reactions that are leading to the big picture. So I think we've
Yes.
got like I think we're about to talk about a really great example of that, how like one reaction, again, and obviously it's more complicated in real life, but the MCAT focuses on this one reaction leading to very big impacts on the body. So let's first talk about like what is chemical equilibrium? What is this point? So chemical equilibrium is this point that every reaction will proceed to. And it is the
Reversible reaction.
every reversible reaction. And I actually have this kind of thing. In theory, every reaction is technically reversible given the right conditions, but but yes, every reversible reaction will proceed to equilibrium. And it's the point where the rates of the forward and reverse reactions are equal. The rates are equal so that there appears to be no net reaction. Doesn't mean that there is no reaction, but there doesn't seem to be any shifting at all. It's this point where the concentration of products and reactants aren't changing anymore. But I want to make this a huge asterisk. Does not mean the concentration of products and reactants are the same. Again, this is a very common mistake where we think, oh, equilibrium, that means same on both sides, same products, same reactants. Does not mean that. Just means the amount of products and the amount of reactants are not changing, right? That's the point of chemical equilibrium. And again, related to this concept of equilibrium is the idea of the equilibrium constant. Now, Molly, walk us through, like, what is the equilibrium constant? How do we find this constant? Like, what determines it?
Yeah. So equilibrium constant is describing where that point is. If
Mhm.
we think of a chemical reaction, right? Everyone
Mhm.
close your eyes, right? You think of a chemical reaction, it's reversible.
Mhm.
On one side, you have what we see as the reactants, right? That's on the
Mhm.
left. And you see that double-headed equilibrium arrow, right? So it could go forward or backwards. And then we see what's on the right side, which we think of as the products,
Mhm.
right? What we're saying here is we've got kind of a tug of war between the left side and the right side, right? Where this equilibrium is going to be. In the idea with the equilibrium constant, we are describing exactly how favored we are for the products versus the reactants, right?
Mhm.
So how much do we prefer? And I feel like with chemical equilibrium, it's useful to think about this visually, right? It's difficult to identify what chemical equilibrium is in a chemical state, right? But think about like if you were trying to write something on a piece of paper, right? Your job as, let's say, the reactant is to write something. Let's imagine that right behind you came someone with an eraser and you were writing and they were erasing as you go, right? Like it's not that you write something and you're done and now you're not writing or erasing anymore. You've reached equilibrium. Now nothing's happening. It's you reach a point where you're writing as much as you're erasing, right? There's
I see
no
where you're going with.
left
Okay.
or right shift. There's
Mm-hmm.
no change in the amount of writing that's on the board or on the paper,
Mm-hmm.
but they're both very active. You're still undergoing the forward reaction and the reverse,
Mm-hmm.
but you reach this point where you kind of hit a rhythm. It's like, okay, well, we're always going to have the same amount, right? We're having this equal amounts of the forward and the reverse reaction here. And the equilibrium constant is describing how much of the products will be found at equilibrium and how much of the reactants will be found at equilibrium, right? So the idea is with KEQ, or the equilibrium constant, you find it by putting the concentration of the products up top divided by the concentration of the reactants. So if we saw KEQ is much greater than 1, that's fine. It means that reaction, right, is product favored. That doesn't mean it's not at equilibrium. I hear a lot of students get confused about this, right?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean if your KEQ is greater than 1 that it needs to be equal to 1, right?
Yeah.
This is at equilibrium.
Mm-hmm.
How much do we prefer the products
Mm-hmm.
compared to the reactants? If KEQ is greater than 1, the products concentration, which is in the numerator, must be bigger. So it's product favored. The reverse is true. If KEQ is less than 1, right, the top, which is product concentration, must be lower than the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
So you're reactant favored.
Mm-hmm. Right. And this tells you really important information about like, okay, which side is kind of like favored in terms of which is more kind of stable. Because I always I like thinking about stability when I think about like which one's at equilibrium, because our reactions at the end of the day are always driven by what's the most stable idea, right? And if your products are favored, that tells you the products are more stable. If the reactants are favored, that means the reactants are more stable, right? It's this idea that all of our reactions at the end of the day, and anyone in my class or anyone I like teach 101 always knows one of my favorite words when talking about reactions is stability. Because at the end of the day, these reactions are always driven by that one singular idea. I mean, it relates to thermodynamics, delta G, all those fun stuff we're not going to dive in today. But that tells you a lot of really important information about which side is favored, can tell you all whole bunch of other stuff. So just thought I'd add that because I'm like, because that's always in my mind. I always like to keep that stability idea in my mind.
Yes, for sure.
Mhm.
And when we talk about equilibrium, right, before we get into applications, one thing that I always want to note, and I say this to all my students as well, whenever you see a big K and then a little subscript, right? Like if you think of KEQ, the equilibrium constant, you have a big K, capital K, with the little tiny EQ, right, as a subscript of that K. If you think about KA, KB, KW, KD, KSP, KC, any of these big K little subscripts, they are all just equilibrium constants. You do the
Every
same
single
thing.
one.
Product concentration divided by reactant concentration. Ka, for instance, is the acid dissociation constant. So on the left-hand side, you have HA, which is an acid that still has its proton. You see that reversible arrow, and then you see plus H plus and A minus, which would be the products of the dissociation of that acid, right? Where the two parts break apart. So Ka, since it's just a KEQ, is the concentration of protons times the concentration of A minus divided by HA, right?
Right.
Every single big K little subscript except one.
Except what I knew this was coming. Like except the one.
There's only one that does not fit this criteria, and it's Km. Km is the Michaelis constant. It is in kinetics land, right? Thermodynamics and equilibria are very important. Those all have to do with energy and stability of the products versus the reactants. Every big K small subscript lives in thermodynamics land, but kinetics, totally different. It's all about speed. So the only exception to that big K little subscript rule is Km. the only one that's not an
I
equilibrium
right, and
constant.
it's so interesting because when when you're in a passage and you see a big K, unless like there's some hint otherwise, you should think of it as an equilibrium constant. Again, normally I see students see a big K and think immediately Michaelis, but there's nothing to do with enzyme kinetics at all. There's like no hint that it is. No, when you see, it's kind of like when you hear hose, think horses, not zebras. Like when you
Yeah.
see a big K, you think equilibrium constants, not Michaelis constant, unless there is something about enzymes and like the Vmax and a Michaelis-Menten graph. Now, okay, now we can start thinking that this might be Km. But absolutely. I think kind of a really important idea with equilibrium and something that really relates to homeostasis, right? Because just like homeostasis, we have this ideal point. Like equilibrium, it's this point where things are happy. But what if something changes? Like, what if we have this reaction and we add more reactant, or we add more product, or we decrease the reactant? Are we still at equilibrium anymore?
No,
Right?
we are not.
Right.
We've gotten too cold or we've gotten too hot. Blood pressure's too high, too low,
And
right?
same idea, right? And but then just like in homeostasis, our goal is to get back to equilibrium. And there's a very, again, as a Canadian, I'm always a big fan of French. There's a very famous Frenchman that was very important for this principle, which is the Chatelier's principle, which is the idea that the reaction is going to shift back to equilibrium, shift in order to get back to that point. So let's think about if we were at equilibrium and then we changed the amount of reactants. We added a whole bunch of reactants. Now, thinking about our equilibrium, where do you think we're going to go from here in order to get back to that point?
So at equilibrium, we're at a point, by
Mm-hmm.
definition, where we're happy with how much products and reactants we have. If
Mm-hmm.
we add a bunch more reactants, my ratios are off. I
Yeah.
am no longer happy, right?
Mm-hmm.
I honestly kind of think about it with baking, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you are, let's say you're making some like brownies, right? And you've got like, you're adding a little salt in it, like a
Mm-hmm.
salted caramel brownie or something
So
delicious,
good, so good.
right? Let's say you have your perfect ratio, and then
Mm-hmm.
someone comes by and dumps a cup of salt in your brownie batter.
Oh,
Like, oh
by the way,
shoot.
get rid of them.
Okay,
Get
like
rid of them
the
immediately.
only, yeah, but let's imagine we couldn't get rid of it. What would you do? Well, you would
Right.
need to add more of everything else to make
Right.
that, like you'd have to balance it out. If you
Mm-hmm.
add a bunch of one component, you need to react to fix it.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, if we have a bunch of reactant, we're going to need to increase the amount of products that we have, right?
Mm-hmm.
Shift that towards the product side. So we shift away from whatever we've added.
Mm-hmm.
Or in contrast, if we removed reactant,
Mm-hmm.
right, we'd see the opposite, right?
These are
Since
too
now we have
much.
too many products compared to our reactants. So we're going to shift towards reactants,
Right.
right? We basically want to oppose whatever shift we've created in that system.
Right. In order to get back to that happy equilibrium ratio of concentration products, concentration reactants. And that's the whole idea of Le Chatelier's. It's as simple as that. Again, it's just kind of like whenever I see a big like principle or I see a theorem, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is becoming so complicated. No, it's just the idea of homeostasis. We're getting back to equilibrium because we're not at that point right now. Right.
Mhm.
And there's a really important application of this on the MCAT, an extremely important one, and that's the bicarbonate buffer system, which is such a critical system. Like the MCAT, like I swear, loves this buffer system. They love it. As soon as you see anything to do with like buffers and blood, like this should be the first thing that comes to your mind. Like talk to me, like what is the bicarbonate buffer system?
Yeah, so this is definitely a system that really combines a lot of topics, which I think is why it's such a favorite for MCAT to
Hmm.
test, right? Bicarbonate buffer system as a buffer definitely involves acid base, right? This
Right.
is essentially the body's way though of maintaining equilibrium or homeostasis with the pH of our blood. So again, we get into acid bases, but we also get into equilibrium and homeostasis. We also get into cardiovascular system
Respiratory
and
system.
respiratory
Yes.
system.
Right.
Yes. So we've got a lot going on. And this will be our last big application, right?
Mhm.
But the idea is, as we know from respiration, right? We know our goal of a respiratory system is to bring oxygen in and to get rid of carbon dioxide.
Mhm.
But think about where all this is going, right? Let's say we have oxygen coming in through our respiratory tract. It's moving into our bloodstream through those alveolar capillaries, right?
Mhm.
Which we talked about last episode. Go back and listen if you
Mhm.
haven't already, right? It travels through our bloodstream to the cells and tissues that need that oxygen, right? It
Mhm.
will be absorbed in. That cell is going to undergo cellular respiration
Which we'll
and
talk about in
produce,
another episode.
yes, which we will talk about, and produce carbon dioxide as a waste product.
Mhm.
Now, bicarbonate buffer system starts where that process leaves off. So
Mhm.
the cell is done with aerobic respiration. We breathe out. I'm talking on a cellular level. That cell is
Mhm.
breathing out
Mhm.
carbon dioxide into the bloodstream. But where does it go from there? Right? Carbon dioxide, to the greatest extent, is going to actually react with water in the plasma or in the bloodstream itself to form a molecule called carbonic acid. And I'm visualizing this as part of the bicarbonate buffer system. You have CO2 plus H2O as a
Mhm.
reactant. You see that double-headed, right? You got arrows on the top
Reversible,
and
right?
bottom in opposite
Right.
directions, right? It's a reversible reaction, creating a molecule, carbonic acid, which is H2CO3.
Mhm.
Okay, so it dissolves in water to create carbonic acid, which is an acid, right? It wants to dissociate, right? It's not
Mhm.
the strongest acid in the world. In fact,
Mhm.
that's part of the point of a buffer, which we'll talk
Right.
about, but it can dissociate. Carbonic acid can break apart into H plus or a proton and HCO3 minus. That is called bicarbonate.
Mhm.
And this system, right,
Mhm.
carbon dioxide dissolves and creates carbonic acid, which can break down into H plus and HCO3 minus or bicarbonate, actually really is key in helping us maintain a solid pH in our bloodstream. So
Mhm.
this has to do with the fact that it's a buffer, and a lot of people might not know what that is. Mike,
Mhm.
what's a buffer? Help us out.
When when I think about a buffer, I'm just thinking about keeping the pH the same, right? And it's really important, especially in the body, to keep the pH the same, right? Because like imagine like our ideal blood pH is 7.4. That is our ideal blood pH. Our blood likes being that pH. If you deviate even 0.05, like if you're less than 7.35 pH or more than 7.45 pH, you are now diagnosed with acidosis or alkalosis, respectively,
We
right?
like
No,
7.4.
we like 7.4. It is very tightly controlled, but like you just talked about before, the body's very dynamic. There are reactions occurring that are going to be producing products that could be acidic. I mean, we've talked about the bicarbonate buffer, could produce acid, they could produce protons, which, increase the acidity, decrease the pH. But there's other things that's going to change the pH, like ketone bodies, for example. We're not diving into those today, but those are also acidic, along with other byproducts. And so all these things are
Acid.
going in and out of the body, like that could possibly change our pH. We need a buffer to keep it the same at that 7.4, or else things might go wrong. And so this is the idea of having a buffer. The bicarbonate buffer isn't the only buffer in our blood, but it's the main one the MCAT likes to talk about. But that's the idea. We want to regulate that pH at that homeostatic 7.4. And this, I think, reaction really kind of links CO2, because normally you don't normally think, like outside the MCAT, like, oh, carbon dioxide and protons and acidity, not related at all. But this is what links the two, CO2 linked to respiration. Now we can start kind of thinking, oh, maybe respiration is somehow linked to our blood pH for some reason or the other, right?
Yes. And I feel like for those of us that are imagining how this all plays out, right? Again, carbon dioxide reacts with water to create an acid.
Mm-hmm.
When carbon dioxide dissolves, acids are created, right? Carbonic acid.
Mm-hmm.
Carbonic acid is not the strongest acid. It is not immediately going to dissolve and break apart
Mm-hmm.
into H plus and HCO minus.
Right.
If our blood pH is a little too high, we're a little too
Mm-hmm.
basic, we need a little extra protons in our blood. Cool. Carbonic acid's like, sweet. You want me to break apart?
I've got a few.
Got it, right? H2CO3, that's me. You want me to release some protons to fix a blood pH that's too high, right? Too basic? No problem. Here you go, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let me shift to the right in our imaginary layout. We'll
Right.
go to protons, which will help bring that pH down, and bicarbonate, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we're currently in protons and bicarbonate, but now our blood pH is too low, it's too acidic, Bicarbonate and protons are like, hey, no worries. I'm happy as carbonic acid too. Let me bind together. Now I'm carbonic acid. No worries, right? Now our blood pH is coming back up to that 7.4.
Mhm.
So I like to think of a buffer as like almost like a sponge, right? It can soak up extra protons. If you take a sponge over
Oh,
a
I like
puddle of
that.
water, it could
Yeah.
soak it up. But also, if you need more water, squeeze the
Squeeze
sponge and
out.
there it is, right? It just
Mm.
holds on to it. It soaks it up, right? You can get more protons from it, or you could use it to soak up, right? It's
Mhm.
its job between H2CO3 minus, which again is
Mhm.
produced when carbon dioxide dissolves in blood or in water, and that H plus and bicarbonate. Now,
Mhm.
this this buffer dynamic is super important because what happens if our carbon dioxide changes? For example, right? If we think of how this relates to respiration, let's say that we get really, really scared about something, right? Or we have a panic attack set in. We're breathing really fast,
Mhm.
really, really, really fast.
Mhm.
Okay, if we're
Mhm.
breathing very quickly, we're getting rid of a lot of carbon dioxide, right?
Mhm.
Since ultimately that's all being picked up from our tissues and released out into the environment when we're breathing out during ventilation, right? That decrease in the carbon dioxide levels in our blood, again, if we think of that long reaction, right? If we're
Uh-huh.
getting rid of something on the left side, which is
And the
carbon
reactants.
dioxide,
Mhm.
we're going to pull away, right?
Right.
Which ultimately, if we have less carbon dioxide to dissolve in water, we have less carbonic acid, which means less to create that proton and that bicarbonate, which
Mhm.
means if we're losing protons in our blood, pH is going to go up. We're going to be
Mhm.
too basic.
Right. Right.
So in
And this
that
is
case,
again, yeah, where
breathing changes acidity.
right, that's that link, right, that they love, how something in your lungs can change your blood pH, right? That whole idea, and again, relating Le Chatelier's, that idea you're taking away a reactant. So it's going to shift to bring back that balance, to bring back that equilibrium, but it also goes the other way, right?
Mm.
Hyperventilation is you're breathing too much, but also with hypoventilation, right? Like say I'm holding my breath, for example, right? I am not releasing the CO2 anymore. So now I'm
Mhm.
holding my breath. CO2 is going to increase. Well, according to that long reaction that we have, if we're increasing the reactants, according to Le Chatelier's, it's going to shift to the right, to bring us back to that equilibrium, shifting to the right. Remember what's on the right, that carbonic acid and then ultimately the bicarbonate and the protons, which are going to increase our acidity, decrease that pH. Again, it's going in both directions, or like that changing in ventilation can impact your pH in both ways. And we're talking about it right now in terms of like this, like, oh, bad thing, like, oh, you got scared, or now I'm holding my breath. But it can also be a reactive mechanism as well. If our acidity changes too much, our breathing can actually help to re-regulate that pH, because it can go in the other way. If I have too much, too many protons on that product side, talk to me, Molly. Like, if I have, what do you think is going to happen to my breathing if my blood becomes really, really acidic?
Yeah, so you have to think about the pathways we just talked about, right? So if we have too much CO2, we're going to shift to the right and produce more protons.
Mhm.
If we have too many protons, which is what you're describing, we're going to shift backwards,
Mhm.
right? If we have too many protons, we need to shift to the left. We need to shift back to produce more CO2 and
Mhm.
then breathe it out,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? So if we're too acidic in our bloodstream, one of the ways that we can fix this is taking
Mhm.
that proton that's contributing to the acidity, combining it with bicarbonate to make
Mhm.
H2CO3, carbonic acid, and then essentially kicking it out of the
Get around
bloodstream,
it, right?
kick that carbonic acid
Mhm.
out, right? Forcing it into carbon dioxide, which we could breathe out, and
Mhm.
then water, which remains in our bloodstream, right?
Sure. Mhm.
Little bit comes out as well, actually, as water vapor.
Like get
But
a little bit in your breath, like when, yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, but you would increase your breathing rate to expel that carbon dioxide and pull that reaction backwards so that you decrease the amount of protons that you have in your blood. And this is actually something we see with diabetic ketoacidosis as well. If you were thinking about times that this may occur,
Mhm.
it's a context in which we see hyperventilation.
Right? Because again, that really acidic, those ketone bodies, which again, not diving into, that's another episode, those ketone bodies being produced are really acidic, right? So pH is lowered, super acidic, it's going to push it to the left. And again, this sort of regulation questions, like you were talking about before, is how the MCAT asks these questions. They say, hey, we were happy, then something happened. You now have high acidic, or maybe now you're too basic, right? What's going to happen to your breathing rate? What can we expect? We use our content knowledge to answer these questions, right? But this, I mean, I kind of want to, there's other kind of mechanisms that we use to control pH other than just the respiratory system, right, Mom?
Yeah, there is.
Hmm.
We
Right?
could actually walk our way into a topic for next week if we wanted to,
Yeah,
but
I
I
mean,
don't want to get there.
okay. If you want to, then I'll let you take the floor for this one.
Well, I don't want to get too much into it because the kidneys,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
kidneys
Super
can
critical.
also
Super
help
critical.
us regulate blood
Mm-hmm.
pH. That would be a more long-term situation,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
We won't talk about it too much this week, but again, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, you might see kidneys show up pretty soon.
Maybe even next episode, possibly.
Maybe.
Maybe even next
Maybe.
episode.
We'll see.
Because again, our body is super dynamic, right? It does. There's a lot of redundancies. I feel like in the body, which makes sense because if there's drastic changes, we can't just rely on one thing to help change it. Most of the time, we want multiple mechanisms in order to help. So, say with our lowered pH, for example, we can rely on breathing, or we also have other mechanisms like the kidney. But again, the kidneys are super, super important. They help with so many other regulatory things and will be the topic of next episode, which I think is a really, really great transition to the next episode.
Yes, for
Yeah,
sure. Right. So, yes, we will talk kidneys next episode. Maybe we could do a quick recap of the things that we talked about,
for
right?
sure.
We started off this episode with an idea of homeostasis, right? Being essentially balance, right? How the
Mm-hmm.
body finds equilibrium, even though it in itself is changing constantly. Conditions are changing constantly in the environment, and the body is trying to keep things as close to ordered as
Mm-hmm.
possible, right? The body wants to rely on that nice homeostatic set points, right? So homeostasis is all about finding and maintaining that balance. We talked about a ton of applications of that. We talked about blood pressure regulation. We talked about lots of different hormonal cascades, positive feedback, negative feedback, definitely things that we will continue to address in the future. This is a very foundational concept. Again, we're in balance. If you mess with my balance, I'm going to fix it. That is the
Mm-hmm.
core component of homeostasis, right? Then we took that to a Gen Chem application and said, you know what? Let's zoom all the way in and let's look at how equilibrium and essentially homeostasis, in air
Mm-hmm.
quotes, applies on this very minute level, right? We talked about chemical equilibrium with equilibrium constants. We talked about, and I want you to say it because you say it with a better accent than
Oh, Le
me.
Chatelier.
That. Yes, we
Oh,
talked
yeah.
about that. We talked about that. I'm
Yes.
calling on the Canadian to give you the
Like,
nice
yes,
French
our French.
pronunciation. We talked about that and how ultimately that is the same thing, right? We're at our happy medium. We're properly balanced. If you disrupt me to the left or the right, I'm going to fix it, right? And then of course we talked bicarbonate buffer system, which is the body's primary example of that. Although really,
Le
give me the
Chatelier.
name.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, I was like, oh, what do you want me to say? Oh, I see. I see.
That, yeah. Ultimately, that is a essentially describing what homeostasis is as well. They, whether we look really, really zoomed in or really, really zoomed out on the context of an entire organism, the idea is the same. It's all about balance.
Balance. Huge. Right. No,
And
and I think this idea of like balance and like negative feedback and keeping the body same isn't just gonna end today. Like a lot of the topics that we're gonna be discussing about in the next episode, like I'm literally looking at the list that we have. I'm like, I can probably give a homeostatic example for every single topic that we're talking
yeah,
about here is gonna be so related. And that's why I think talking about this early, before we talk about those things, is really critical for contextualizing why we do these things. When we
yes,
talk about, acids and bases, we've already sort of touched on it with the buffers today, why it's super important. But also when it comes to when we talk about metabolism, right? Metabolism is all about homeostatic regulation. So
Mhm.
having these ideas in the
Hormones.
back, hormone, how could I even miss that? Hormones like coming up soon is also it's super involved. So having these ideas of always keeping balance in the back of our minds while we're studying these things, I think is critical to actually understanding them.
Yes.
Yeah.
And right, with balance comes disruption of balance. So know anytime you get questions about homeostasis, the most likely context that the AMC is going to ask you about, right, is what happens when I mess with it? How will the body respond?
What
How will the solution respond if I mess with it in this way? Right. And like you talked about before, that's all about application. So make sure to get lots of practice with this. It is not enough to memorize what positive feedback is or negative feedback is. It's not enough to memorize the bicarbonate buffer system expression. You need to understand these as we've built today, right? But then you also really need practice because they get pretty creative with the ways they ask questions about this. So, little plug, we've got a ton of free questions on our website. If you go to jackwestin.com and on the left-hand side you click question bank, we've got hundreds of questions and passage-based questions that are all about homeostasis and equilibrium, right? So go check them out, right? Especially those fundamental passages and questions. You can really choose a specific content area that you want practice with. Get lots and lots of practice with this. Of course, you will see it addressed in other topics as well. These are very overarching, very important fundamental concepts, but get practice with this as soon as you can. And come see us again next episode.
When you're not practicing, when you're not practicing and you want to kind of join us, we're going to talk about the kidneys and their applications and how the MCAT's really going to ask you questions about the kidneys. So stay tuned, get excited.
Yes.
All right. Well, with that, we'll see you all later.
Bye.